Right. But, I mean, I know you're a big student of history like I am, and so I wanted you to maybe elaborate a little bit, because obviously people don't tune in to hear me calling from time to time. But it just really seems incredulous and as if we're just bypassing history. And I want to point out 2 points and maybe have you talk a little bit more. First of all, with the President Biden upping the ante on the type of weapons that you apparently need to take over the government. Of course, he did leave out the Davy Crockett hat and the Viking horns. Apparently, those are very powerful weapons as well. But this whole nonsense about, you couldn't own cannons back in the revolutionary time period. I mean, I think history is going to, if people that study that will show that that's not entirely true. Civilians were entitled to own cannons. In fact, did particularly on merchant ships that were non-military vessels. First, I wanted maybe you could talk a little bit about that. But the other idea is this calling of these, whether it's the AR-15 or whether it's an SKS or something, they're calling these weapons of war, which, of course, most of them, are highly regulated if you want to either have on a 3-round burst or on a fully automatic setting, which, of course, is readily available in the military. So it's not exactly a weapon of war. But how does that coincide, or how does that jive, if you will, with the revolutionary time period? Because wasn't the musket essentially the AR-15 of the 1700s? And didn't you have civilians had the exact same weapons that the military have? And, of course, I think, to go ahead and look ahead, the argument is, you couldn't inflict mass casualties with the muskets like you could an AR-15. But wasn't the musket and wasn't eventually the rifle, if you will, which is a rifle-barreled musket, if you will, I mean, wasn't that a game changer? I mean, people forget about what a firearm is and what a game changer that was in the history of warfare. I mean, this is the first time that you really had the ability on a single individual basis to take out another opposing force from distance. I mean, yes, you had some degree of throwing hammers, the Orient, you had some throwing knives and stars, but this is really, you had the sling, not to be confused with the slingshot, but this was really the first time to be able to inflict deadly consequences on an opponent from far distance. So wasn't that a game changer? I mean, back before you had muskets, before you had, rifles, you had to be basically, essentially, almost right up on a human being to be able to kill them in war. I mean, you look at the old Roman times with the phalanx, and you look at those things. So, obviously, the government didn't have a problem with the average citizen having a weapon of war in the 1700s. So why should the government have an issue now? And I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about that, as I've already gone on too much.
Well, you make some really great points, Murdoch, and I appreciate that, because I think, and one of the big problems that we face, which your points highlight, is a lack of historical study, a lack of historical context. Now, this is brought about by a schooling system, an education system that is designed really more to indoctrinate compliant citizens than to educate people, to open people's minds, and to help people become the best individual citizen that they can be, and to learn about these things. It brings to mind, the idea from the book 1984, the quote, "He who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future." And we're almost seeing that playing out now in real time when they're flushing things down the memory hole, because we're now living in the present, and the present regime is now telling us, things that we know happened didn't happen, and things that we know didn't happen actually happened. And that's what Biden was trying to do right there, and they're going to keep pushing this. So he says, look, cannons have always been restricted. People were always restricted. That was kind of the joke that I made at the end of last segment. They were running background checks in the late 1700s. I mean, all of that is historically false, and we can document that it's historically false. Like you said, we can document civilian ownership of cannons back then on merchant ships. We can document that civilians were able to own the same basic firearm that a soldier in the Army could own. So to your point, the musket. And, of course, we've totally lost the historical context of what a game changer, like you said, the firearm itself was. I mean, how is it that a couple of hundred Spaniards, who, by the way, didn't have rifled barrels, but they just had things that made it boom really loud and sent out a lead weight, basically, like a lead fishing weight, would fire out of the end of one of these conquistadors' little firearms that they had. And so a couple of hundred of them could actually conquer a couple 100,000 or more Aztecs, because those people were scared to death of the boomstick. And then you see somebody, getting hit by one of these things, and it seemed like alien technology to them. And, of course, at that time they said it was coming from the gods. They thought this was the white winged serpent, Quetzalcoatl, had come back finally. Now, that's a long story we don't really have time to get into the details of, but they thought that these white Spaniards coming over were the return of the white-winged serpent, who was one of the progenitors of their entire civilization, Quetzalcoatl, that they had talked about. Now, we don't know who Quetzalcoatl was, if that was just all made up, if there really was a historical reference for that, were they visited by somebody, we don't know, but they certainly, that was their belief system, and they certainly appeared to believe it. So they thought he was coming back, and he had the magic boomsticks, and wow, a couple of hundred people could conquer a couple of 100,000 people with what today would be so rudimentary, you wouldn't even want to have one of these firearms in battle, because essentially it'd be just a way to signal to folks with real firearms where you were so they could shoot you there. So it's just crazy to think, though, that there was some kind of initial restrictions on the ownership of firearms, because there wasn't. This is more of the change of historical facts that's going on. We see this everywhere now. And I think it's part of the death of our civilization, unfortunately, if we let it continue. If we don't stand up, we don't fight back, and we don't have people who are willing to educate themselves, because you can't count on government schooling anymore to educate you to a certain level. So you've got to have a curious mind. You've got to disbelieve the what's handed down to you, the propaganda from the authority figures, and that's very hard for a lot of people to do that, to stand up to disbelieve what an authority figure tells them, and you've got to go do your own investigation. And so can we turn this around? I don't know. We've got to have people who want to turn it around, who, first of all, see that it's a problem, see that they need to make a change. Unfortunately, to see that it's a problem and feel like you need to make a change, you kind of already have to be educated on this stuff. That's the big problem. So for folks to now go and get educated, despite what the authorities are telling them, that's going to be very difficult if they don't already have some basis in that. And I think this is a problem we're going to face going forward. It kind of brings to mind that show Idiocracy, where people just keep getting dumber and dumber and dumber generation after generation. And, honestly, sometimes that's what it feels like we're living in. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.